Hello and welcome to this Biology 6 lecture on the senses. And I should say, welcome to part one of it because I've split this lecture into two lecture videos. It's kind of a long lecture and it just fits better by splitting it into two. So, yes, so this is part one of the senses lecture. Okay, well, in grade school, you learned that there were five senses. Your grade school teacher probably told you that we human beings have the sense of touch and hearing and vision and taste and smell. And so we're going to cover these five senses in this lecture. You know, the physiology of how these five senses work. But there's also two other senses. One's called proprioception and the other's called equilibrium, which are also senses that we human beings have. But for some reason, they don't mention those other two on in grade school. Anyway, so we're going to cover the five you see here, and also proprioception and equilibrium. All right, well, before we get into the actual individual senses on this list, let me talk a little bit about senses and sense organs in general. So each of the senses has a particular organ where it's housed in, so to speak. Like, for instance, you know that your sense of vision happens in your eyes. Your sense of vision is takes place inside your eyes. Or just to give another example, you know that your sense of smell is housed inside your nose. In other words, your nose is the sense organ where your sense of smell is located. Yeah, so each sense has its own particular organ where it's housed, where it takes place. And inside each of those sense organs, you'll find what are called the sensory receptors for that organ. The lecture handout defines them like this. The sensory receptors are the cells inside a sense organ that detect the sense stimulus, meaning the light or the sound or the smell or the touch or whatever. They are the cells inside the sense organ that that detect the sense stimulus and then change that sense stimulus into a nerve signal. Okay, now where does the sensory receptor send that nerve signal? And the short answer is to the brain. All the sensory receptors have to send their nerve signals to the brain because the brain is where your consciousness resides. So to be consciously aware of the smell or the vision or the touch or whatever the sense stimulus is, those nerve signals have to reach your brain. Now, with some sense organs, the sensory receptors send the sense signal directly to the brain through cranial nerves. Remember, cranial nerves are nerves that connect directly to the brain. But other sense organs send their sense signals to the brain first into the spinal cord, and then those sense signals go up the spinal cord to the brain. Those are sense organs that connect to the brain through spinal nerves. So all the sensory receptors in any sense organ always eventually send their signals to the brain, but some of them send their signals first into the spinal cord, is what I'm saying. And so that's why in this diagram I just said CNS over here, because the sensory receptors sometimes connect directly to the brain, and sometimes they connect to the spinal cord first before those signals get to the brain. Okay, so in some sense organs, the sensory receptors are sensory neurons, just like you see here. And you remember the way sensory neurons work. The dendrites, which you see over here, detect the stimulus, and when they detect the stimulus, the sensory neuron generates a nerve signal, which then passes through the sensory neuron and then into the CNS. Matter of fact, let's see that here. This right here are the sense stimuli coming in, and then the dendrites of the sensory neuron detect the stimulus. In response, a nerve signal, an action potential is generated, and then that nerve signal is passed into the CNS, just like you see there. Okay, so in some sense organs, that's what the sensory receptors are. They're just a sensory neuron. In other sense organs, it's a little more complicated. In other sense organs, the sensory receptor is actually made out of two cells. One cell is the sensory neuron, but the other cell is what they call a specialized epithelial cell. And in this type of sensory receptor, the specialized epithelial cell's job is to detect the stimulus. And then when it detects the stimulus, then the sensory neuron generates a nerve signal which is sent into the CNS. So in this type of sensory receptor, it's almost as if the neuron has subcontracted the job of detecting the stimulus to this epithelial cell. It's almost as if the neuron said, hey, I don't want to use my dendrites to detect the stimulus. Hey, epithelial cell, you detect the stimulus for me, and then I'll have the nerve signal. Matter of fact, I think we'll see that here. Here comes the sense stimulus. And so in this type of sensory receptor, yeah, the epithelial cell detects it, and then the sensory neuron has a nerve signal, which then gets sent into the CNS. Okay, so and we call these both sensory receptors. In other words, it doesn't matter if a sensory receptor is just a single sensory neuron or if the sensory receptor is the sensory neuron plus the specialized epithelial cell. In all cases, we just call it the sensory receptor of the sense organ. Okay, and one last thing about these sensory receptors. Each sense organ has its own special type of sensory receptor to detect its own type of sense stimulus. In other words, your skin has sensory receptors to detect touch, and those touch sensory receptors in the skin can't detect sounds or tastes. And likewise, the sensory receptors in your eye, they detect light, and they can't detect touches or sounds. Yeah, so in each sense organ, the sensory receptors are specialized just to detect the one particular type of sense stimulus that organ is supposed to be detecting. Okay, now that you know the basics of the sensory receptors inside the sense organs, let's now begin talking about the senses of the body. And we will begin with the sense of touch. Now, the sense organ for your sense of touch is the skin. You can see a cross-section of the skin here. And the sensory receptors inside your skin that give you a sense of touch are these ones that they're showing here and here and here. Those are called the cutaneous receptors. The sense receptors in the skin that give you your sense of touch are your cutaneous receptors. And there are actually several different types of these cutaneous receptors. Some of them detect the pressure. You know, if you're touching something, you can feel that it's pressuring, it's pushing on your skin. Others detect the texture, whether the thing you're touching is rough or smooth. Others detect the temperature, you know, whether what you're touching is hot or cold. That's also part of your sense of touch, right? Is the temperature of the thing that you're touching. And there are other ones that detect damage to your skin, you know, whether the thing that you're touching has pierced your skin, has cut you. Those are called nociceptors or pain receptors. And, you know, all of these work simultaneously. When you touch something, you're simultaneously getting nerve signals from the pressure receptors and the texture receptors and the temperature receptors and the nociceptors, and all of those cutaneous receptors simultaneously are sending signals to your brain, and your brain interprets all those simultaneous signals as your sense of touch, you know, as what the object that you're touching feels like. Okay, that's basically all I'm going to say about the sense of touch. The individual types of cutaneous receptors do have their own names, but in this class, in this Bio 6 class, you don't have to memorize the names of the individual types of cutaneous receptors. If you're curious and you want to know, in your textbook there's a table 10.2 that lists them by name, but like I say, I'm not going to hold you responsible for their individual names. Just know that they're called the cutaneous receptors, and you know, and that some are pressure and some are texture and some are temperature and some are nociceptors. Okay, let's go on to the next sense that we're going to talk about. The next sense is called proprioception, and it's your ability to feel what position your body parts are in. And let me give you an example of what I mean. Even if you're not looking at your arm, you can tell whether your arm is straight or curled up. In other words, you can sort of feel whether your arm is straight or curled up. And, you know, it's not just your arm, your leg and your fingers and pretty much all your body parts. You can feel what position they're in. Well, your ability to sense what position your body parts are in is called proprioception. And the sensory receptors for your sense of proprioception are called proprioceptors. They are the sensory receptors in your muscles and joints that sense the body part's position for you. So here you see some examples of them. Here's a proprioreceptor that's embedded in this muscle, and here's a proprioreceptor that's embedded in the joint. And so, yeah, so they detect whether the muscle is contracted, and therefore those are the proprioreceptors. Anyway, they detect whether the muscle is contracted, and therefore the joint is bent. And if they detect that, then they send signals to your brain, and you feel that body part is curled up, is bent. And they also detect whether the muscle is relaxed, and therefore the joint is straight. And so that, in this position, that allows you to feel that the body part is straight. Yeah, so these proprioreceptors are inside your muscles and your joints, and they are constantly reporting to your brain the position of your body parts. That's how you feel whether your body parts are straight or bent or whatever position they are in. Okay, the next sense that we're going to talk about is our sense of vision. And obviously, the eyes are the sense organ for our sense of vision. So let's start off with a little bit of the anatomy of the eyes. Your lecture outline defines the eyes, also known as the eyeballs, as the two ball-shaped visual organs. Okay, well, so yeah, let's talk about the anatomy of the eye. Each eye has connected to its outside some muscles. We can call these the external muscles of the eye. And these control the eye's voluntary movements. And what we mean by that is it's these external muscles on the outside of the eye that allow you to move your eyes left, to look to the left, or to move your eyes to the right, to look to the right, or to move your eyes up or down. And so, these are voluntary muscles, right? Because you can choose whether you want to look left or look right or look up and look down. And in fact, these external muscles are the only voluntary muscles of the eye. We're going to talk about a couple of other muscle types of the eye, but all the other muscle types of the eye that we're going to talk about are involuntary muscles. These external ones are the only voluntary muscles of the eye. All right, so let's do a slightly different view of the eye now. Let's imagine you're looking straight into somebody's eye. Now, some parts of it, of course, are kind of white looking. We call that the white of the eye. But when you're looking into somebody's eye, there's always that colorful region, right? That part is called the iris of the eye. And on some people it might be brown, and some people it might be blue, and other people it might be gray or hazel or green. It has a lot of different pretty colors, but anyway, the colorful part of the eye is called the iris. And in the middle of the iris, you'll always see a round black part. That's called the pupil of the eye. Okay, so what is the iris and what is the pupil? Well, the pupil is actually a tiny hole. It's an opening into the interior of the eye, and it's where light enters the eye, right? There's got to be a hole for the light to get inside the eye. That's what the pupil is. The iris is actually some smooth muscles, some pigmented smooth muscles, and the job of the iris is to control the size of the pupil. In other words, different ways that the smooth muscles of the iris can contract or relax can make the pupil larger or smaller. And the iris does that. It changes the size of the pupil to control the amount of light that's entering the eye. Just as an example, imagine that it's very dim. Maybe it's nighttime and you want to go for a walk around your neighborhood at night. Well, you need to let in as much light as possible into your eye under dim conditions. And so your iris then, the smooth muscles of your iris contract in a way to make your pupil as large as possible so you can see more under those dim light conditions. Now imagine the opposite scenario. Imagine that you're going for a walk around your neighborhood, but it's totally bright summer daylight. Well, in that case, there's so much light that it could potentially damage your eye. And so if it's very bright light, your iris smooth muscles contract in a way to make your pupil as small as possible to protect the eye from excess amounts of light getting in. All right, well, now we're going to look at a cross-section of the eye to see some of the anatomy inside the eye. And so here's our cross-section. Just so you know, this part right here is the front of the eye, and this part right here is the back of the eye. You can see a little bit of the iris they're showing in blue there, and right there is the pupil. Yeah, so that's towards the front of the eye, and here's the back of the eye over there. Okay, maybe another way of saying the same thing is this eyeball is looking to the left, so to speak. Okay, but yeah, we're looking at the interior of the eyeball here. So a lot of the eye is actually a hollow space. This whole orangey area right here is a hollow region inside the eye. And the hollow regions of the eye are filled with some clear liquids called the humors of the eye. The clear liquids that fill the hollow spaces of the eye are called the humors. But, those are liquids. They're not like they're tissue layers. Where you find the tissue layers of the eye are here in the wall of the eye. And the tissue layers that make up the wall of the eye are called the tunics of the eye. And there are 3 tunics. Matter of fact, if you look closely, you can see that pretty clearly. 1, 2, 3. 3 tunics make up the wall of the eye. Okay, so let's begin with the outer tunic. So most of the outer tunic is a white-colored, dense connective tissue, and we call that part of the outer tunic the sclera. Remember that dense connective tissue is a tough and leathery tissue, so the sclera basically makes a tough and leathery protective coating on the outside of the eye. But right here in front of the pupil is another part of the outer tunic that's clear, and that part is called the cornea. The clear region of the outer tunic is the cornea, and it has to be clear so that light can pass through it and then go through the pupil, and enter the eye. Okay, so the sclera and the cornea together are the outer tunic of your eye. The next tunic, this middle one right here that's colored red, is called the choroid coat. The choroid coat is the middle tunic, and it's blood vessels. All organs in your body need a blood supply, and the blood vessels of your eyes are there inside that middle tunic, and we call that tunic the choroid coat. Okay, and moving inward, the innermost of the 3 tunics is called the retina. Here it is, and that the retina is the light sensing layer. It's made of nervous tissue. So it's some of the neurons in that retina are the sensory receptors that actually detect the light that has come into the eye. Okay, moving a little bit more towards the front of the eye here, just behind the pupil is the lens of the eye. There we go. And just like the lens on a camera, its job is to focus the light. And to be more particular, the lens's job is to focus the light onto the retina, because that's where the neurons are that sense the light. And so let me show some light rays here. Here you see some light rays coming in, and those light rays pass through the cornea, and then pass through the pupil, and then pass into the lens. And the lens's job is to focus those light rays onto the retina. Now, let me just mention something here. We're going to talk quite a bit in this lecture about how the eye focuses the light. And whenever we're talking about focusing, when you see the light rays coming to a point, that's called the focal point. And the focal point shows where the image is in perfect focus. So anytime I show you a diagram like this, where the focal point is right on the retina, that means the person would see the image in perfect sharp focus. If I ever show you diagrams where the focal point is not on the retina, you should interpret that to mean that the person would see the image blurry and out of focus. For instance, if I showed you a diagram where the focal point was behind the retina, you should say, okay, the person's going to see the image blurry and out of focus. And likewise, if I show you a diagram where the focal point is in front of the retina, likewise, you should say, okay, that is also going to be blurry and out of focus. So again, only when the focal point is square on the retina, only then should you interpret that to mean that what the person is seeing is going to be sharp and in focus. Okay, now the lens of your camera is made out of glass, and obviously glass is not flexible, but the lens of the eye is different. The lens of the eye is made out of a soft and flexible gel-like material. And that's important because that allows the eye to adjust the focus, because the shape of the lens can be changed. And to be a little bit more particular, notice that there's these structures. These are actually muscles that surround the eye. you see some there and there. Those are called the ciliary body, and they are they're a group of round, smooth muscles, involuntary muscles that attach to the lens, and by contracting or relaxing, the ciliary body muscles can pull on the lens, which changes its shape, and that adjusts the focusing. That adjusts where the focal point of the lens is. And we'll talk more about how the ciliary body adjusts the shape of the lens to change where the focal point is. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in this lecture. All right, and continuing on, here towards the back of the eye, we have the optic nerve here. The optic nerve carries the visual sensory signals, the nerve signals from the retina. The optic nerve carries those visual nerve signals from the retina to the brain. Now, incidentally, the optic nerve, as you can kind of see, is an extension of the nervous tissue of the retina. So in this diagram, I'm showing the nervous tissue of the retina is yellow colored, right? And you could see that the optic nerve is also yellow colored. And yeah, so what I'm trying to say there is that the optic nerve is an extension of the nervous tissue in the retina. And to be a little bit more specific, the optic nerve is some axons of the neurons of the retina. Some of these neurons of the retina send their axons to get bundled together here, and so the optic nerve is simply the bundled together axons of some of the neurons of the retina. In the next slide, you can see the optic nerve coming out the back of the eyeball here, and then if you look closely, you can see it goes to the brain. Now, where exactly does it connect to in the brain? Well, eventually those visual nervous sensory signals that come down the optic nerve, eventually they're delivered to the back of the brain. The back of the brain is called the occipital lobe, and in the occipital lobe is your visual cortex. That's the region of the brain that receives and interprets the visual sense signals that come from the eye by way of the optic nerve. Okay, let's get back to that cross-section of the eye for a moment. Here it is. We're going to now discuss the retina, the inner of the three tunics that I'm showing in yellow right here. That's the layer that, remember, that has the sensory receptor neurons that detect the light. Now, before we zoom in on the retina here, let me mention a couple things. So in my diagram, I'm coloring the retina in yellow, as you can see here. That's not actually its color, but that's the color I'm going to use. So yeah, when we're discussing the retina, we'll see yellow colored. And the other thing I want to mention is this. Notice in my diagrams of the eye, the front of the eye is to the left, and the back of the eye is on the right side of my diagrams. And I'm going to keep that. As we zoom in on the retina here, even when we zoom in on it, the left side of my diagrams will be more towards the front of the eye, and the right side of the diagrams will be more towards the back of the eye. Okay, so all that being said, let's now zoom in on that yellow bit right there, zooming in on the retina. So here's the retina right here, and again, the left side of the diagrams, that's the part of the retina that's pointing towards the front of the eye, and this right side of the diagram, that's the part of the retina there that's pointing towards the back of the eye. Okay, so your lecture outline says this: the retina is the innermost tunic of the eye. It contains nervous tissue, and some of that nervous tissue of the retina converts the light that enters the eye into nerve signals. Okay, now the retina is made out of nervous tissue, but you might say, well, where is it? Where are the neurons? Well, let me kind of peel away the yellow layer there a little bit, and now you can see these neurons of the retina there. Now, as you can kind of see, there are three different layers of neurons. There's the layer that I've kind of colored in blue here, and there's another layer of neurons that I've kind of colored in pink here, and there's another layer of neurons towards the back of the retina that, well, they're kind of yellow and pinkish colored. But anyway, there are three different layers of neurons that together make up the retina. And these three different layers of neurons, there are different types of neurons and they have different names. The layer of neurons that's more towards the front of the retina are called the ganglion cells. So those blue guys right there are the ganglion cell neurons. The layer of neurons that's in the middle of the retina, the ones that I'm showing in pink right here, are called the bipolar cells. And the layer of neurons that are more towards the back of the retina, the ones I'm showing on the right here in pink and yellow, are called the photoreceptor cells. Okay, so so we have the ganglion cells, the bipolar cells, and the photoreceptor cells. Those are three different types of neurons, three different layers of neurons, and the retina is all three together. In other words, when we say the retina, we mean the ganglion cell neurons and the bipolar cell neurons and the photoreceptor neurons. We mean all of those together. Oh yeah, just a word of caution here. So remember that the wall of the eye is made out of three tunics: the outer tunic, the middle tunic, and the inner tunic. And the retina that we're looking at now is the inner of those three tunics. But the retina itself is divided into three layers: the ganglion cell the layer, the bipolar cell layer, and the photoreceptor layer, right? And so that's potentially confusing, right? Because the entire wall of the eye is three layers: outer tunic, middle tunic, and inner tunic. But the inner tunic, the retina, is itself three layers. And so sometimes when I'm asking quiz or test questions about the eye, students get confused about whether I'm talking about the three layers of the wall of the eye or the three layers of the retina. So always read the questions carefully. If the question relates to the three layers of the eye, am I talking about the three layers of the retina or the three layers of the wall of the eye? Anyway, so I just thought I'd put that caution out there. Okay, so as it turns out, only the photoreceptor neurons, only those neurons can absorb and detect light. The ganglion cell neurons and the bipolar cell neurons do not absorb light. They don't detect any light. That's just not their job. Only the photoreceptors can absorb and detect light. Okay, so let's now zoom in on just the photoreceptors then to talk a little bit more about them. So here they are. So these are the only neurons in the retina that actually absorb and detect light. And as it turns out, there are actually two major types of these photoreceptors. The ones that have kind of a cone-shaped thing towards their back are called the cones. How's that for a sensible name, right? So this photoreceptor right here is a cone type of photoreceptor, and so is this one down here. And the other of the major types of photoreceptors are called the rods, and those are that types right there. Well, those are the two types of photoreceptors. In other words, the cones are photoreceptors and the rods are photoreceptors. So you might wonder, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is in what basically hues, what sort of shades of light they detect. Cones give you color vision. Cones are specialized photoreceptors to give you color vision. And it almost rhymes. Cones are for color. Whereas the rods give you black and white vision. All right, those are the two types of photoreceptors, and as you remember, the photoreceptors are they're the layer of the retina's neurons that's most towards the back of the eye. Okay, and so we're now going to see some light that has entered the eye and is going to come. Now remember, the front of the eye where the light enters is from the left side of my diagram, so when I click here, we'll see a ray of light coming in from the left. Okay, now here comes that ray of light, and it passes through the ganglion cell layer, and it also passes through the bipolar cell layer unabsorbed, because those neurons don't absorb light. The ganglion cells and bipolar cells just don't absorb light, and so the light just travels right through those two layers of neurons completely unabsorbed. But the photoreceptors do absorb light, and so when that light ray reaches the photoreceptor layer, those photoreceptors will absorb it, and when they absorb light, they generate a nerve signal, a visual sensory nerve signal. Okay, and so that nerve signal eventually has to get sent to the brain, right? Because the brain is where all sensory signals end up. Well, the first thing that happens is the photoreceptors, when they've generated their visual sensory nervous signal, the first thing that photoreceptors do is pass it into the ganglion cells. They pass it into the bipolar cells, right? And then when the bipolar cells get the nerve signal, then they pass it into the ganglion cells. And when the ganglion cells get the visual nerve signal, it moves into their axons. These little black lines you see here are the axons of the ganglion cells, like you see right there. And as you can kind of see, the axons of the ganglion cells get all bundled together like you see here. Well, let me zoom out a little bit. Here you see the ganglion cells right there, and these black lines right here are the bundled together axons of the ganglion cells. So notice all those axons of the ganglion cells here, and also from this part of the retina, all of those ganglion cell axons eventually all become totally bundled together right here, right? And that's actually the optic nerve. So the sensory visual signals come down from the retina and pass into the optic nerve right here. And again, the optic nerve is the bundled together axons of the ganglion cells of the retina. Okay, yeah, so those visual sensory signals come down out of the retina through the axons of the ganglion cells, which that's what the optic nerve is, and then those visual nerve signals travel along the optic nerve and through the optic nerve and eventually into the brain. Here we go. And I guess I mentioned this before. In the occipital lobe of the cerebrum is an area called the visual area, or sometimes the visual cortex. And that's the area of the cerebrum that receives and analyzes visual sensory signals. In other words, the signals have to arrive there for you to experience the sight, for you to be able to see the thing that you're looking at. All right, let's get back to this view of the back of the eyeball there. Okay, so well, anyway, you know that the optic nerve is the bundled together axons of the ganglion cells of the retina. Now, there's something else interesting in this diagram. So you can see the retina right here. If you look closely, you can see the three layers: the ganglion cell layer, the bipolar cell layer, and the photoreceptor cell layer. And remember, of course, the photoreceptors are the ones that actually absorb the light, right, and detect the light. Well, notice that there are no photoreceptors right here. And you might say, well, of course, that's where the optic nerve is coming out the back of the eyeball. And yeah, that's true. But the fact is, if there are no photoreceptors right there where the optic nerve is coming out, then you can't have any vision in that part of the retina, right? Because for you to see things, you have to have photoreceptor cells to absorb the light and make a nerve signal. And so, yeah, in that part of the retina right there where the optic nerve is coming out the back of the eye, you don't have any sense of vision. And the name for that area is called the blind spot. It's sometimes called the optic disc, but most people call it the blind spot. So it's where the optic nerve is exiting the back of the eyeball, and at that spot there are no photoreceptors, and so you just don't have any vision there. Now, so you might wonder, well, why don't I see a little black blind spot when I look around? Well, one reason is that your blind spot is kind of in your peripheral vision. It's off in the side of your field of view, so you don't notice it all that much. And another reason is your brain sort of paints over, sort of photoshops the blind spot out of your conscious perception of what you're looking at. But in any case, you all of us do have a blind spot, and that's why we have it, as you can see here, because it's where you have no photoreceptors, because that's where the optic nerve is coming out the back of the eyeball. All right, let us return to our view of the three layers of the retina for just a second. Here they are, and of course remember that the backmost of the three neuron layers of the retina are the photoreceptor cells. And also remember that of those photoreceptor cells, there are two types. There are the cones that give you your color vision, and there are the rods that give you black and white vision. Let's talk about the cones in a little bit more detail, the ones that give you color vision. So as it turns out, there are actually only three types of cones. There's a type of cone that detects green. We can call that the green detecting cones. There's a type of cone that detects red. Those are the red detecting cones. And there are blue detecting cones. And that's it. Those are the only types of cones that you have. And so those are actually the only colors that you can see. So your eye can actually only detect green light and red light and blue light, and that's it. And so you might say, well, that's not right. I can see orange, I can see purple, I can see yellow. There's probably thousands of colors that you can see. Well, here's the way it works. Just like an artist can take three primary colors, like you see here, and mix them in various ratios to give different colors. Like, you mix these two, you get green, and you mix these other ones here, you can get some oranges or purples or different colors like that. So just like an artist can take just three primary colors of paint and mix them together in various ratios to get thousands of different colors, your brain does the same thing. Your brain takes the visual signals from just your green detecting cones, your red detecting cones, and your blue detecting cones, and your brain mixes those together mentally to allow you to experience all the other colors you can see, yellows and oranges and purples and all the other thousands of colors that you see. Those are created in your brain just by mixing these three primary colors of these three cone types. Now, there's an interesting genetic disease that relates to color vision. It's called color blindness. So, color blindness is a genetic disease where a person is born without one of the cone types functioning. For example, some people are born without their green cones functioning. So these people would never get to experience the color green because they just don't have any cones for detecting that shade. And they test for color blindness using tests that look like this, where there's a pattern of dots on a card, and they show the person that they're testing these cards. There's a pattern of dots on the card, and written in a different shade amongst the dots are some numbers. Like if you have good color vision, you can see that on this card is the number 74 written in green dots, whereas the background sort of looks like brick red or maybe slightly orangey red. So if you have good color vision and all your cones are functioning, you can see the 74 because it's a different color than the background dots. But if you were colorblind for your green cones, then you would not be able to see green color, so you would not be able to see the 74. The colors of those 74 would just blend into the background colors, and you would not be able to see the numbers. And so, that's what they do with color blindness tests. They show the patient a series of these cards that look like this with numbers written amongst the dots in different colors. And if the person can see all the numbers correctly, they have good color vision. But if they're not able to see some of the numbers on some of the cards, it shows that they're missing one of their cone types, and we call that genetic disease color blindness. Now, because of the way the genetics work for color blindness, it's much more common in males than in females. About 1 in 12 males is colorblind, but only about 1 in 200 females is colorblind. So it's not impossible for a woman to be colorblind, but it's just a lot more rare in women than it is in men. Okay, just to do kind of a quick review, the photoreceptor cells are the cells in the retina, the neurons in the retina that actually absorb light and then generate a nervous system signal when they absorb the light. And of course, there are two types of photoreceptors. There are the cones that detect color and the rods that give you black and white vision. Okay, well, what I want to discuss now is how the photoreceptor cells detect light. The photoreceptor cells, they absorb light and then they generate a nerve signal. How exactly do the photoreceptors know when they've been struck by light and so that they're supposed to make a nerve signal? Well, here's the way it works. So in the back part of each photoreceptor cell, in other words, in the cone-shaped part in cones, and in the rod-shaped part in rod photoreceptors. I don't have any rods in this diagram, but the back part of the rod photoreceptor cells is kind of rod-shaped, not cone-shaped. Anyway, in the back part of the photoreceptor cells, there's always some molecules that are called opsin pigments. And these opsin pigments are light-absorbing molecules. And these opsins are actually a family of closely related molecules. They're not all exactly the same as each other. And the differences in the opsins allows them to absorb different colors of light. For instance, the cones have opsins that absorb red light. That's what makes cones for the specialists in detecting red light, and the opsins in the green cones only absorb green light, and the opsins in the blue cones only absorb blue light. Anyway, so yeah, so all photoreceptor cells, both cones and rods, they have these opsins in them. And here's the way the generation of the visual sense nerve signal works. When light comes in that the opsin can absorb, let's use some red light as an example. Oh yeah, so sorry. So there are the opsins in these three photoreceptor cells. So when light comes in that the opsin can absorb, let's say red light hits that opsin right there, it changes the shape of the opsin. Matter of fact, it changes it so much that the opsin gets split into two molecules. And when that happens, we say that the opsin has been bleached. All right, and the photoreceptor cells are able to detect when the bleaching has occurred. In other words, the photoreceptor cell is able to detect when its opsin has been split into two molecules, and that's what triggers it to have the nerve signal, the action potential. Yeah, so that's the basic idea. The opsins absorb the light and get split into two. They get bleached, and when that happens, that tells the photoreceptor, hey, it's time for you to have a visual nerve signal. And of course, you know what happens from there. The nerve signal travels out of the photoreceptors and goes into the bipolar cells, and then it goes from there into the ganglion cells. Then the ganglion cell axons become the optic nerve, which then eventually goes to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe of the brain. But the point I'm making now is that the photoreceptor cells generate the nerve signal when their opsin has been bleached, has been split into two. Now, the bleached shape of the opsin very quickly reverts to its unbleached shape. In other words, very quickly the opsin molecule comes back together, basically to reset the photoreceptors, and now they're photoreceptors ready to be struck again, and so to detect more light. Same basic thing for all the photoreceptors. Like, for instance, if blue light comes into the eye, here we go, it can be absorbed by the opsins in the blue cones, and when they get split, that's what makes the blue cones generate their nerve signal. And if green light comes into the eye, then it can be absorbed by the opsins in the green cones, and well, and then the story. Then they generate the nerve signal, and that's how green light is detected. Okay, now just one final interesting fact about these opsins. You might have heard when you were growing up that carrots are good for your vision. And the reason why I say that is carrots are high in vitamin A. And as it turns out, vitamin A is one of the ingredients that these photoreceptor cells use to make their opsins. So in that sense, carrots and vitamin A are good for your vision. But the fact is that most of us get enough vitamin A in our diet without eating a whole bunch of carrots. So don't feel you have to eat carrots or take vitamin A supplements to have good vision. You probably get enough vitamin A anyway. Alrighty, well, we've been talking about how the photoreceptor cells detect light. I want to shift gears a little bit now, and this will be the last part of our discussion of the vision sense. I want to shift gears now and talk about how eye focusing works. Okay, so I guess I mentioned a little bit about this before, that objects are in focus when their focal point falls right on the retina. In this diagram right here, here's the object. Here are the light rays coming out of the object in blue, and the light rays, they pass through the cornea, they pass through the pupil, they pass through the lens, and then the lens brings the light rays to a focal point. And I'm using the white here to be the retina. So when the focal point of the light rays falls exactly on the retina, that means the object will be seen as sharp and in focus. But if you ever see the focal point not falling on the retina, then that means the object will look out of focus and blurry. Okay, so this eyeball right here, this person with the eyeball is looking at someone's holding up a finger there, pointing at something. Anyway, so they're looking at the hand right there, and the person whose eyeball this is would see this hand as being in focus. But let me show you something kind of interesting here. When an object starts moving closer to the eye, when the object starts getting nearer to the eye, look what the focal point does. Like you see there, that the closer an object is to a lens, the further behind the lens the focal point is going to be. And that's not just something about the lenses of eyes. All lenses, whether it's the lens on the eye or a camera or whatever, any type of lens, That's always true. The closer the object is to the lens, the further behind the lens the focal point is going to be. So if an object, like you see here, gets really near your eye, it gets close to the lens of the eye, then its focal point can end up behind the retina, like you see right there, and that's going to be out of focus, right? Because the focal point is not falling on the retina. So this object, this near object, would look blurry like this, to the person, right? Well, so if the person wants to see this near object in focus, what do they do? Well, that's where the ciliary body comes into play. Remember, the ciliary body is this group of smooth muscles that surround and attach to the lens. Like here's part of the ciliary body and here's part of the ciliary body also. Yeah, and the ciliary body can contract to change the shape of the lens. There was, yeah, the ciliary body. The ciliary body muscles can contract to change the shape of the lens in a way that adjusts where the focal points are located. And so what I'm saying is that's what your ciliary body's job is. It's to help focus the light of the object that you're looking at. In other words, the job of the ciliary body muscles are to change the shape of the lens so as to bring the focal point of the object that you're looking at onto the retina, so you can see the object sharp and in focus. Okay, so that's the basic idea of how the focusing in the eye works. The ciliary body muscles can pull on the lens to change its shape, and when the shape of the lens changes, that adjusts where the focal points are falling. Okay, so that's the basic idea, but now I have to add a little bit of more detail to that concept. So let's start off talking about when the ciliary body muscles are relaxed, like you see there. Good. Okay. So when the ciliary body muscles are relaxed, let's imagine the person's looking at some faraway object like a cloud. This fluffy white thing is supposed to be a cloud. Okay, so person's ciliary body muscles are relaxed and they're looking at some far object. Here are the light rays from that object. They come into the eye and the lens focuses them right onto the retina. The focal point of the far object is right on the retina. Cool. So the person can see this far object, like the cloud, in perfect sharp focus. Now let's talk about a near object. I'll use a ladybug. That'd be something that they're looking at close, right? Now I'm going to sort of fade the far object in the background for a second, just so we can focus in on the near object. Okay, so now there's this near object. Well, remember what I said a few minutes ago, that when the closer objects get to the eye, the further deeper their focal points are going to be, right? So the light rays from this near object are going to be deeper than the far object focal point that I just showed you, and therefore they're going to be behind the retina. The focal point will not be on the retina, so this near object would look out of focus and blurry to this person, right? Okay, no, actually, so let me bring the far object focal point back into the picture here. There we go. Okay, so when the ciliary body muscle is relaxed in your eye, far object focal points are on the retina, and near object focal points are behind the retina. So when you are relaxing your ciliary body muscle, the far objects are in focus and the near objects are out of focus. And let me kind of pause here for a second. So notice in this diagram, I'm using blue light rays to be the light rays from the far object, right? And I'm using green light rays to be the light rays from the near object. And just put those colors in your short-term memory banks for the rest of this lecture on focusing, because throughout this lecture I'm going to continue to use blue for the far object light rays, the far object focal points, and I will continue to use green for the near object focal points. Anyway, so what I was saying is when the eye is in its normal, healthy, natural state, when the person is relaxing their ciliary body muscle, far objects are in focus and near objects are out of focus, because the far objects, the lens is focusing the far object focal point on the retina, and the near object focal point is behind the retina. Okay, so, but what if you want to see the near object, like the ladybug, in perfect sharp focus? Well, what you do is you contract your ciliary body muscle. When you contract your ciliary body muscle, it pulls on the lens, to change the shape of the lens, and it changes the shape in the lens in a way that brings all the focal points more forward in the eye. If you look what's going on there with the focal points, you can see that all the focal points, the far object focal points and the near object focal points, all got moved forward in the eye when the lens changed shape, when the ciliary body muscle was contracting. So that's how you focus in on near objects. You contract your ciliary body muscles, and that changes the shape of the lens so that all the focal points move forward in the eye. And so now the far object focal points will be in front of the retina, and the near object focal points will be on the retina. And so that means that the near objects will be in focus, and the far objects will be out of focus, but the point is now you can bring the near objects into focus. And what we just saw there has a term. It's called accommodation. Accommodation means when you contract your ciliary body muscles to change the shape of the lens, to move all the focal points forward in the eye. And again, the purpose, the function of accommodation in a normal, healthy eye is to allow you to focus on near objects, because accommodation brings the near object focal point onto the retina. All right, and if you want to see the far objects, then you do the opposite. If you want to see the far objects in focus, you relax your ciliary body muscle, and then the lens goes back to its other shape, its relaxed shape, and so that allows the focal points to move more backward in the eye. And so now notice what's going on there. Now the far objects are in focus because their focal point is on the retina, and the near objects are once again out of focus because their focal point is behind the retina. All right, so what you're seeing here is the normal way the eye works. You contract your ciliary body muscles to bring far objects, you relax your ciliary body muscles to bring far objects into focus, and you contract your ciliary body muscles to bring near objects into focus, and that contraction is called accommodation, and it moves focal points forward. In your lecture handout, I tried to capture that concept of how focusing works in a normal, healthy eye with a diagram like this. And these diagrams in your web handout, lecture handout, I'm using black as the light rays from the far object and gray as the light rays from the near object. So like I just said, for when a person has normal vision, they relax their ciliary body muscles to see the far objects in focus, which means that the near objects will be out of focus because they're behind the retina. Their focal point is behind the retina. But with a person with normal vision wants to see near objects, they contract their ciliary body muscles. That moves all the focal points forward, which brings the near object focal points onto the retina. So now the person can see the near objects in focus. The far objects are going to be out of focus because those are not focal pointed on the retina, but the near objects are when they contract their ciliary body muscles. Oh, and just a kind of a tangent thought here. If you're like studying for a test or something, so for many hours at a time you're holding a book close to your eyes and reading. Well, the book is a close object, a near object, and so for hours at a time you're going to be contracting your ciliary body muscle to read the book. And just like any muscle, the ciliary body muscle can get tired, and so after a while the book may start looking fuzzy. Some people say, oh, my eyes are tired, I can't focus anymore. Well, what you're just supposed to do is not look at the close object, not look at the book for a few minutes, focus on some far object like a cloud or something for a few minutes, and that you're relaxing your ciliary body muscles then, and that gives them a chance to recover, and so then you're ready for another study session where you're again going to contract your ciliary body muscles to see the book close up. Okay, so all of that was how focusing works in a normal eye, in a normal, standard, healthy eye. We're now going to start talking about focusing disorders, basically problems people have with focusing. Before we jump into the disorders, let me one more time show you this diagram just to remind you about what normal, healthy eyes work, how the focusing works in a normal, healthy eye. And remember that I'm using the blue lines again to be the light rays from far objects and the green lines to be the light rays from near objects. Okay, so in a normal, healthy eye with no focusing problems, remember that when the ciliary body muscle is relaxed, the far objects are in focus because their light rays focal point is on the retina, and when the ciliary body is relaxed, the near objects are out of focus because their focal point is behind the retina. Okay, cool. So the first focusing disorder we're going to talk about is called hyperopia. Its informal name is being farsighted, but the correct term is hyperopia, and we define it like this. It's a vision disorder where far objects can be focused, but near objects cannot be brought into focus. And as for the cause, it's this. It's where the lens is not in the correct shape. The shape of the lens has taken on an abnormal shape, such that when the ciliary body muscle is relaxed, like you see here, all the focal points, both the near object and the far object focal points, all the focal points are behind the retina. Matter of fact, let me just show you that here. So here we go. So notice, there we go. So that this is hyperopia. When the ciliary body muscles, well, in hyperopia, all the focal points are further back than they are supposed to be. And yeah, that's kind of the way to think of hyperopia in as few words as possible. With hyperopia, it's where all the focal points are further back than they're normally supposed to be. Right, because when the ciliary body muscles relax, they're supposed to be more forward, such that the far object's focal point is on the retina, right? Okay, so hyperopia, shape of the lens has changed, so all the focal points are further back than they are supposed to be. And so what does that mean in terms of what the person can see? Well, notice that all the focal points are behind the retina, right? And so all these objects are going to be out of focus. Both the far objects and the near objects, all of their focal points are behind the retina. And so the person with hyperopia will see everything blurry when they relax their ciliary body muscles. But there is a way for the person with hyperopia to see the far objects, to bring the far objects into focus, and that is by contracting their ciliary body muscle. Because remember, when you contract your ciliary body muscle, it brings all the focal points forward. And so people with hyperopia, when they contract their ciliary body muscle, they're able to bring the far objects onto the retina so they can see the far objects in focus. Matter of fact, let me click that here. So here's the person with hyperopia contracting their ciliary body muscles, and you can see all the focal points move forward. Here we go. Good, yeah, so they contract the ciliary body muscle, all the focal points move forward, and they're able, by contracting their ciliary body muscle, to get the far object focal points onto the retina. Now, there's a limit to how far they can contract the ciliary body muscles, so they can't contract them enough to bring the near objects onto the retina. So the near objects are always going to be out of focus. But nevertheless, by contracting their ciliary body muscles, they can get the far objects into focus. And notice that's kind of different with people with normal, healthy vision. Remember, they see the far objects by relaxing their ciliary body muscles. But with people with hyperopia, they have to contract their ciliary body muscles to see the far objects in focus. Now, just to recap here, if the person with hyperopia relaxes their ciliary body muscles, then the lens goes back to its normal relaxed shape. And because the lens has this abnormal shape in hyperopia, that puts all the focal points behind the retina, so everything's out of focus. But if the person wants to see with hyperopia, wants to see the far objects in focus, they contract their ciliary body muscle. And anytime you do that, it brings all the focal points forward. And so they are at least able to get the far objects into focus by bringing those focal points onto the retina. But not the near objects. They can't contract the ciliary body muscles enough to quite get those near objects in focus. So that's, coming back to the definition of hyperopia, it's where the far objects can be focused, but the near objects can't be brought into focus. All right, let me show all that in a black and white diagram. Now, this is the normal vision diagram that we talked about before, but the song and dance, I'm using the black lines here as the far object focal points and the gray lines as near object focal points. And with a person with normal vision, when they relax their ciliary body muscles, they can see the far objects because the far object's focal point is on the retina. And the person with normal vision, when they contract their ciliary body muscles, that's when they can bring the near objects into focus, because contraction moves all those focal points forward, and they can move them far enough forward to bring the near objects into focus. For a person with hyperopia, hyperopia means that all the focal points are going to be further back than they are in a normal eye. And so when the person with hyperopia relaxes their ciliary body muscle, everything is out of focus because none of the focal points are on the retina. But when the person with hyperopia contracts their ciliary body muscles, that moves all the focal points forward, and they can move forward enough to get the far objects into focus by bringing those focal points onto the retina. All right, very good. Now, let me talk for a moment about corrective lenses. If people have focusing problems, they oftentimes get glasses or contact lenses, and we call those corrective lenses. And so let me talk about the corrective lenses that are given for hyperopia. And I'll use the ciliary body muscle relaxed part of this diagram to talk about the corrective lenses. Okay, so this is what I'm showing you here is when the ciliary body muscles are relaxed. And well, you know the song and dance: with normal vision, ciliary body muscles relaxed, far objects are focused on the retina, and near objects are out of focus because their focal point is behind the retina. But with people with hyperopia, the focal points are too far back, and so when they relax their ciliary body muscles, everything is out of focus because all focal points are behind the retina. Okay, so the purpose of corrective lenses is always to move the focal points to where the focal points should be in a healthy eye. And so with hyperopia, remember the problem is that the lens shape has changed so that all the focal points are too far back than they're supposed to be. So with hyperopia, the corrective lenses move the focal points forward to get the focal points where they're supposed to be in a normal, healthy eye. And so, yeah, corrective lenses for hyperopia are lenses that move focal points forward in the eye. And so I'll click on it here, and you can see those focal points move forward. And yeah, just like I told you, yeah, with the purpose of corrective lenses is to move the focal points back where they're supposed to be. So for hyperopia, that means moving the focal points forward in the eye. All right, the next and last focusing disorder we're going to talk about is called myopia. Its unofficial name is being nearsighted, but the correct term is myopia, and it's the opposite of hyperopia. And let me explain what I mean by that. So this diagram right here is normal vision. And again, just to remind you, I'm going to use blue as the light rays for far objects and green for the light rays for near objects. In a person who has normal, healthy, standard focusing for their eye, when they relax their ciliary body muscle, far object focal points are in focus because far objects are in focus because their focal point is on the retina, and near objects are out of focus because their focal point is behind the retina. That's when their ciliary body muscle is relaxed for a person with normal vision. Okay, so yeah, we're talking about hyperopia vision disorder, and the lecture handout defines it as a vision disorder where near objects can be focused, but far objects cannot be focused. Okay, so what's going on? So in myopia, the lens has taken on an abnormal shape such that all the focal points are, when the person is relaxing their ciliary body muscles, the near object focal points are on the retina and the far object focal points are in front of the retina. Matter of fact, let me just show that to you. Here's where the focal points are for a person who has myopia, like this. Yeah, so the person has myopia, when they relax their ciliary body muscles, the near object focal points are on the retina and the far object focal points are in front of the retina. Or saying the same thing in a simpler way, people with myopia, their focal points are more forward in the eye than normal. All right. When the person with myopia is relaxing their ciliary body muscles, what's in focus and what's out of focus? Well, the near objects are in focus and the far object are out of focus, right? Because the near objects are being focal point on the retina, and the far object focal point is not on the retina, it's in front of the retina, right? So they can see the near objects sharp and in focus, but the far objects are going to be blurry and out of focus when they are relaxing their ciliary body muscles. Okay, so here's my question to you. Can this person with hyperopia bring the far objects into focus by contracting their ciliary body muscles? What do you think? If they contract their ciliary body muscles, can they bring those far objects focal points into focus? And the answer is no, because remember that contracting the ciliary body muscles moves the focal points forward, and that's not going to do anything. Matter of fact, it's going to make the situation worse, right? Because here it is, when they contract their ciliary body muscles and all those focal points move forward, now none of the focal points are on the retina, so everything is going to look blurry. Far objects will look blurry, and near objects will look blurry when the person with myopia contracts their ciliary body muscles. So the best they can do is to relax their ciliary body muscles, and that at least allows them to see the near objects in focus, but the far objects are going to be blurry whether or not they're contracting their ciliary body muscles. And so getting back to the definition of myopia, that's why we say it's a vision disorder where the near objects can be focused, but the far objects cannot be focused. And I think the next slide summarizes this in black and white. Well, again, here's normal vision again, both ciliary body relaxed and ciliary body contracted, and well, you know it, ciliary body relaxed, the far objects are in focus, and ciliary body contracted, the near objects are in focus. That's for normal vision. For a person with myopia, when they relax their, with a person with myopia, the focal points are more forward in the eye than they're supposed to be. And so for a person with myopia, when they are relaxing their ciliary body muscles, the near objects are in focus because the near object focal points are on the retina. But when the person with myopia contracts their ciliary body muscles, then everything is out of focus because none of the focal points are on the retina. All the focal points are in front of the retina when they contract their ciliary body muscles. Okay, let's talk about corrective lenses for people who have myopia. And again, I'll use the situation where the ciliary body muscles are relaxed to talk about the corrective lenses. Okay, so let's imagine the ciliary body muscles are relaxed, and so here's a person with normal vision. The far objects are in focus because their focal point is on the retina, and the near objects are out of focus because their focal point is behind the retina. That's normal vision situation for a relaxed ciliary body muscle. Okay, and for the person with myopia, remember the problem with myopia is all the focal points are more forward in the eye than they're supposed to be. So for the person with myopia, when they relax their ciliary body muscle, near objects are in focus, focal point on the retina, and far objects are out of focus. Their focal point is in front of the retina. Okay, so remember, the goal of all corrective lenses is to move the focal points to their normal positions. And so in myopia, the problem is the focal points are too far forward, so the corrective lenses move the focal points backward. And here you see that right there. Yes, that's what the corrective lenses for people with myopia do. They move the focal points backward to restore them to the positions they would be if the person had normal vision. Okay, well, believe it or not, we have finished our discussion of the eye senses. And so this chart that you see here is in your lecture handout. It summarizes where all the focal points are for normal vision and hyperopia and myopia in situations where the ciliary body muscle is contracted or relaxed. And so I hereby declare that you are now an expert in how the focusing of the eye works. As a matter of fact, we talked about all types of things with the eyes, how the color detection works, the layers of the eye, the tunics of the eye, the retina, the lens, the ciliary body. So we are finished with with our discussion of the eye sense. And so that's the end of this part 1 of the senses lecture. And so now please watch part 2 of the senses lecture. I will see you now in that lecture.